Bam, 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 bum, bum. Da, 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 bum, bum. It is time for the Duke of Edinburgh class. Yes. So why am I so excited and why am I so happy to be doing this class? Because usually when I start bringing up, people make me go, oh, but one of them was lost at Jutland. Oh, a warship was sunk in a war. That means they must have automatically been a terrible design. It was a forerun of Matapan and it involved 4 battleships at night. Let's be honest. If the poor cruiser had survived that, we'd be talking about the great and glorious Black Prince and forevermore be putting it in the same mould as Warspite for magically managing to survive. Basically, unless you've got plot armor, there's no way you're getting out of that situation. And ultimately, these ships are very, very good ships for the Royal Navy. They're very valuable. They're very worthwhile. There's a reason the Goeben and Breslau are running from them. There is a reason they are in the 1st Cruiser Squadron for the Royal Navy. There is a reason the Royal Navy is as happy to have them as they are, and there is a reason the Royal Navy models their next generation battleships, the dreadnoughts, on them, because they are a good design. So, I hope you will enjoy this video. I hope you enjoy this discussion. And without much further ado, let's get on with it. So, this is what it'll be, slide 1 of 16 slides. So, expect to get a lot. The Duke of Edinburgh class are special. I think they could have been even more special because I think they could have had double 9.2-inch guns. And I think a design that's going around sporting 6 double 9.2-inch guns as its primary weapons, even if it does have the 6-inch guns mounted in such a way that, frankly, and this is courtesy of legacy of William White more than Philip Watts, that those 6-inch guns are incapable of really being operated in anything but the most pleasant of seas. Nope. Even without those extra 9.2-inch guns, even without the power and the fury that that could have brought, I think Philip Watts does an excellent job on these ships. I think coming in at 1.193 or 1.2 million pounds, they are a steal. And I think the fact that, yes, one of them gets sunk at Jutland is often used to hold against them. But there again, I don't think there's any real chance of a squadron that's led by a commander, and we'll get into this, who decides he's going to charge between the 2 battle fleets at Jutland actually surviving. And I think the fact that the Duke of Edinburgh does survive is testimony to the qualities of the class. They were special because they were the first armoured cruisers which were officially designed to work with the battle fleet rather than protect merchant shipping, i.e. they were designed to provide reconnaissance for the battle fleet and anti-cruiser capabilities. This is why they have the 9.2-inch guns. If you've listened to the Friday video, which should have come out, which was me going through secondary armaments, if they've got a 6-inch secondary and they've got a 9.2-inch primary, they are focused on cruisers. They are focused on taking out cruisers. These are your counter-reconnaissance ships. If they had 4-inch secondary, that will be taking out destroyers. 6-inch suggests that they're thinking about targeting something with some degree of armor and structural strength. It might not be overwhelming, it's not a battleship, but it's something capable, so it's a 6-inch gun. 9.2-inch is the same. That's your long-range gun for hopefully hitting and taking out a heavier cruiser. Simply put, these were the ships which probably should have been at the Battle of Coronel. They could have done that well, but they were in too much demand elsewhere. But just because they're built to work with the battle fleet doesn't mean they can't do the traditional role. In fact, if you look at their characteristics, they are capable of doing the traditional role. Again, 6-inch guns and 9.2-inch guns, they're going to cause trouble for a surface raider. And that is the primary threat you're thinking about when you're designing ships to protect the merchant fleet at this time. You're thinking about surface raiders. Submarines in the Great Submarine War of World War I, which in some ways is far more successful than the War of World War II, are to come. And the lessons that will be learnt from them are to come. Submarines are there, they're known about, but honestly, the capabilities of the submarines in 1903 is far and away of what the capabilities of submarines in 1916 will have, and is certainly nowhere near the capabilities of submarines in 1942. And certainly not 43. So when you're building these ships, you're building them on the qualities they need to operate. Pretty much, the Royal Navy had been thinking about, and to an extent these can be argued to be almost proto-battle cruisers, because the Devonshire class preceded this. And after this, the Royal Navy sort of thought, well, hang on. Lots of other navies now have cruisers. And those cruisers, traditionally, the battle fleets have been, the Royal Navy been thinking about, have been composed of battleships, and torpedo boat destroyers have been starting to come up and start to feature as part of those battle fleet formations. But the trouble is, most navies have looked at the Royal Navy's torpedo boat destroyers and gone, you know what? I'll have a cruiser take out that. If you've seen other videos of me, I have pointed out that you have basically the torpedo boat destroyer, torpedo boat destroyer, destroyer, the torpedo boat destroyer, destroyer, destroyer. Well, here you go. So, you've got the torpedo boat. Then you have the torpedo boat destroyer, a vessel which can carry torpedoes but also destroy torpedo boats. The French then respond, and various other navies respond with various light cruisers, which are the torpedo boat destroyers. Meet the Duke of Edinburgh class. The torpedo boat destroyer. It makes sense when you're dealing with naval warfare. What I find slightly disconcerting is that they do only have 3 torpedo tubes. I think they should have had probably 4 would have been what I would have gone with, but they've gone for 3. And they carried 18 torpedoes for those 3 tubes. They're all submerged tubes. But they also carried an additional 6 14-inch torpedoes that could be used by 2 45-foot-long steam pinnaces that they also carried. So, yeah. The cruiser packed torpedo boats. And we think distributed firepower is something new. 9.2-inch guns, 6 single turrets. I know, a double would have been so much prettier, but... And would have made a point I'm going to be making later easier, but... 10 single 6-inch guns, which you can see are all in a casement along there. And 20 single quick-firing 3-pounder or 47mm Vickers guns, which are quite a useful system. Again, that's going to deal with your enemy torpedo boats. These are ships which are supposed to mix it up in a fight. They're supposed to be the ones which can go in to a swirling dervish match and come out having made sure that the Royal Navy's torpedo boat destroyers have been able to destroy the enemy's torpedo boats, because the ships which are supposed to destroy them have been destroyed by the Royal Navy's torpedo boat destroyers. Destroyers. It does make perfect sense. Stats. That's 12,790 tons in normal and 14,189 tons in deep. Length, 505 feet, 6 inches, or 154.1 meters. Beam, 73 foot 6 inches, or 22.4 meters. Again, remember what I've been talking about in videos about dry docks. This is important. The number of dry docks which can take these ships matters. The fact is, the Royal Navy was very, very proud of the fact that they could get quite so many dry docks to accommodate these ships. And that does feature in their design. When we consider it, there's even a dock at Chatham which can take them. Okay, they have to be lightened, but number 5 dock at Chatham can take them, as can number 9 dock. They can be accommodated by 13, 14, 15, and the new lock at Portsmouth. At Devonport, well, they could be accommodated by 8, 9, 10, and the North Lock. They could be accommodated by Holboy Line in Cork. They could be accommodated by 1 and 2 docks in Gibraltar. And they could be accommodated by 4, 5 and 6 and 7 docks at Malta. Plus, they could be taken in at Bermuda, in the floating dry dock. They could be looked after at Simon's Bay, Hong Kong, Rosyth. Pretty much every dockyard the Royal Navy needed them, and every space around the world where the Royal Navy had a major dockyard, they could accommodate these ships, which means they matter. Which means if you're putting them for long-term deployment on stations, these ships can be there. That's the trouble again when we start looking at battle cruisers. They're far more limited in their dry dock facilities. Power came from 20 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers and 6 cylindrical boilers, generating 23,000 indicated horsepower via 4-cylinder triple expansion steam engines that drove 2 shafts for a top speed of 23 knots, or a range of 8,130 nautical miles. Interestingly enough, there were some studies and some consideration put into making these ships turbine-powered. They didn't go with it because they decided turbines weren't a mature technology at this point. But it is an interesting what if these ships had been turbine-powered, how fast they would have been. I think myself, considering the turbine technology at the time, the power generation capabilities of it, and the fact they would have had to go for all water tube boilers, I think you could be talking 25-knot ships, which is conservative but viable. But it would have added cost and risk, so you'd probably be talking about ships which were an extra £300,000. So that's why they didn't go for it. We've been through the armament, but there is also the armour to consider. Remember, these ships were supposed to be able to mix it up in a fight. Between 3 and 6 inches on the belt. Decks 0.75 to 1.5. Barbettes 3 to 6 inches. Turrets 4.5 to 7.5 inches. Conning tower 10 inch. And bulkheads between 2 and 6 inches thick. That's a lot of survivability being baked into these ships for 1903. And remember that when we're talking about things later and operations later. There's a lot of survivability being baked in for 1903. And this is the gentleman who puts it all in there, Sir Philip Watts. Now, it's rather interesting because when I started talking about him, I, of course, had a conversation with some colleagues. And the universal thing which came back was, this was a guy trying to design ships and trying to do the best job he could in a very changeable environment, where new technologies were coming into maturation all the time. And one day the ship you're designing could be absolutely cutting edge, and next day something which you've hard baked in because you have to in stricter design is no longer considered the best of the best because something new's turned up. The fact he builds the quality of ships he does, and that he's director of naval construction from 1902 to 1912, and gets this wonderful obituary written about him in Society obituary. He is, of course, the revolutionary designer behind the Ellsworth Cruiser, Dreadnought, and all sorts of other ships. He's known for the quality of the ships he produces. He's known for the quality of battleships, especially, he built. But he also produces some pretty darn cool other ships. He is the mind behind the Queen Elizabeth class in their design, and he's also the mind behind the Lord Nelson class. So, the 9.2-inch Mark 10 naval gun. Now, there are actually a couple of marks of this, and you should note that there's, of course, there is the Mark 9, 10, and 11, or other X something on the bottom there. This is one of those really capable guns the Royal Navy is very lucky to possess. Its Mark 9 variant was designed as a coastal defence gun with a free motion breech, but only 14 of those were built. The Mark 10 was introduced in 1900, incorporated a single motion breech, and changed the rifling, which succeeded them. The Mark 10 remained in service as coastal artillery until 1956 and with Portugal until 1998. There are a total of 284 of the Mark 10X, Mark 10 gun were built by Vickers, of which 28 examples are known to survive today. All except one fitted on barbette mounts. One in Cape Town is on a disappearing mount, and that's quite cool to go and look at if you get a chance to be down in Cape Town. The Mark 9.2-inch Mark XI, or 11 gun, produced in 1908, increased the bore length to 50 calibers in an attempt to increase the velocity further. Unfortunately, it proved unsuccessful in service and was phased out by 1920. Now, my theory for why the Mark 9.2-inch gun proves unsuccessful in service and doesn't get as much attention as it probably does is because of the vessels it's put on. It's placed on the Minotaur class armoured cruisers, which have only 4 guns on 2 twin mounts, and the Lord Nelson battleships. There are also some considered for use on the Roberts class monitors, but they weren't actually in fitted. But I think if you'd had a decent cruiser design going around with them on, they would probably have been in service throughout the interwar. I.e., if you'd been building a 9.2-inch cruiser, which the Royal Navy was planning, also alongside when it's thinking about the Hawkins class, at the 18,000-ton mark, these would have been what would have been fitted. And of course, 9.2-inch comes in at 234 millimeters, which is a pretty capable weapon. This particular Mark 10 was fitted to the Cressy, the Drake, the Duke of Edinburgh class, the Warrior class, the King Edward VII class, and the M15 class monitors, and proved pretty darn capable of all of them. The Mark 11 could have been capable if it had been fitted to more ships and had been fitted in ships which were actually going to see service and work things out and actually have the quality aboard they needed for that. Plus, there's the fact that the Minotaur class are possibly some of the most unlucky ships in terms of their service record of any in the Navy in World War One. Duke of Edinburgh class, HMS Black Prince. HMS Dreadnought, launched 1906. Duke of Edinburgh, HMS Black Prince, launched 1904. King Edward VII, launched 1903. Why have I got these 3 up here? Why am I putting all these 3 up here? Because traditionally, I've presented this before. I usually talk about how the Duke of Edinburgh class, especially their design, their hull shaping, their layout of their guns, leads into the shaping, design, and structuring of the Duke of the Dreadnought. How they flow into each other. Believe it or not, there are actual historians who actually write that the Duke of Edinburgh class starts off as the cruiser version of the King Edward VII class. And I can see that, because they have 9.2-inch guns, like the King Edward VII's do, as they're said. Although for the KE7s, they're secondary armoured. And they do have some similarities in layout, in terms of where the guns are placed. But the thing is, the hull design, profile, and shaping is actually very different. So you could also say that the Duke of Edinburgh class are the stopping off point between the KE-7s and the HMS Dreadnought. They take a shaping in terms of a gun that works and a layout of guns. They put it in a new hull to test the hull, and then they expand the hull to build the battleship which replaces that. It's an iterative design process, and it's something you can do when you're building a lot of ships, and it works. I would say myself, I much prefer the designs and lines of the Duke of Edinburgh class and Dreadnought, but King Edward VII were not bad ships. In fact, they were pretty darn cool. Even though they're pre-dreadnoughts, they get up to quite a lot of action in World War One. In fact, at the outbreak of the First World War, the King Edward VII were sent to the ground fleet to support the Northern Patrol and conduct sweeps in the North Sea for German warships, though they never actually saw combat. In 1916, King Edward VII struck a German naval mine, that's the vessel pictured, and sank, though her crew was safely evacuated before she was sunk. By mid-1916, the surviving ships were no longer suitable for frontline fleet service, and so they were dispersed over tasks, including, of course, coastal defence with Nord Command, and for Operation the Gallipoli campaign. Africa was sent to the Atlantic Patrol in 1917, was later stricken with Spanish flu. Britannia was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat 2 days before the end of the war, and one of the last British vessels sadly to be lost in that conflict. And all the surviving members of the class were sold for scrap in the early 1920s. But this does mean there was rather a lot of 9.2-inch guns going around in the 1920s that if the Royal Navy had been building heavy cruisers, they could have found uses for. Here's my pretty. Doesn't actually look good. HMS Duke of Edinburgh. That is a gorgeous looking ship for you. That really is a gorgeous looking ship. And that tells you what you need to know about her, because when someone turns around to me and says, "Oh, they're proto battle cruisers and they're just for operations with the Grand Fleet," I go, "No, they're not. They're not. You can tell that in their designs. You don't spend that much time shaping a hull and designing it to look like that for it not to be able to do the primary cruiser role of diplomacy and deterrence." And look, where is she? Oh, this picture is of her in New York in 1909. What do you know? She's off doing diplomacy. She's supposed to be operating the battle fleet, though, isn't she? Well, yes, in wartime she will do. In peacetime, she's got to earn her keep. And the cruiser role for that is diplomacy. So that's what she's off doing. She was built by Pembroke Dockyard and laid down on the 11th of February 1903, launched the 14th of June 1904, and completed the 20th of January 1906. Her fate would be to be stricken in 1919 and sold on the 12th of April 1920. She had a range of 8,130 nautical miles at 10 knots, or a top speed of 23 knots. Now, I've already discussed the impact of turbines. Well, I also think, and this is the other interesting reason to go with the triple expansion engines, whilst you probably could have got a higher top speed, I wouldn't be surprised if your range would have been shortened by going with turbines at this point. Unless you went for oil firing as well, which is a long way away. So 8,130 nautical miles. That's a long range. At 10 knots. Yeah, she's not designed for trade protection at all, is she? 8,130 nautical miles at 10 knots. keeps up with merchant ships, most of which at this time are doing roughly 8 to 10 knots, if you're lucky, and has the range to escort them long ways. That's the important thing. After she was launched, she was assigned to the 5th Cruiser Squadron, which she served with 1906 to 1908, and then was transferred to the 1st Cruiser Squadron of the Channel Fleet. When the Royal Navy's Cruiser Squadrons are reorganised in 1909, Duke of Edinburgh rejoins the 5th Cruiser Squadron in the Atlantic Fleet. And as part of the Atlantic Fleet, she wanders all the way around the world. She's actually named for, by the way, not, of course, modern Duke of Edinburgh, who sadly not long ago passed away, but for Alfred, one of Queen Victoria's sons. When war broke out, she's involved in the pursuit of the battle cruiser Goeben and Breslau, the light cruiser. And I'll get into that in more detail later. In August, Duke of Edinburgh and her sister, Black Prince, went to the Red Sea to protect troop convoys arriving from India. And on that duty, she actually captured the German merchant vessel Altair, 3,200 gross registered tons on the 15th of August. While escorting a troop convoy from India to France in November 1940, Duke of Edinburgh provided cover to 3 battalions of infantry that seized the Turkish fort at Çekirsaid at the entrance to the Red Sea. Don't take this the wrong way, but interesting relations going on with the Ottomans as early as November 1914 here. The ship then landed a demolition party, which blew the fort up on 10th of November, and then she rejoined the convoy. Typical cruiser duties. She rejoined 1st Cruiser Squadron and transferred to Grand Fleet in December 1914. And in March 1916, the ship had her main deck 6-inch guns removed and the openings plated over. They were never much use. 6 of the guns were remounted on the upper deck, 3 on each side, between the wing turrets. And these were protected by gun shields. But otherwise, she has lost all those lower ones, which were... Also, the fact that she keeps the 6-inch guns and doesn't end up going for 4-inch guns shows that the Royal Navy is still considering her a cruiser engagement tool. If you had been thinking, hang on, she's going to be dealing with destroyers, she's going to be dealing with lighter ships, 4-inch guns fit would have been far lighter, far easier from a hull perspective to accommodate, especially in terms of ammunition transfer and movement, because a 4-inch shell is far easier to move around than a 6-inch shell. And you could have set her up with a couple of multi-barrel mounts, so you could have given her probably 3 twin 4-inch mounts. Again, all useful, but no. She takes part in the Battle of Jutlan. Again, we'll be talking about that. And after the Battle of Jutlan, she is transferred to the 2nd Cruiser Squadron and is eventually ordered to reinforce the patrols north of the Shetland Islands against German blockade runners and commerce raiders. Ship's foremast is converted to a tripod to support the weight of a fire control director in May 1917, but we're not quite sure when the director was actually fitted. We do know it was fitted, but we're not quite sure whether it was fitted in May 1917, which I personally think would be most sensible. But there again, these things are not always the most sensible. The Royal Navy does have a history of fitted for, not with. So, yeah. 2 more 6-inch guns were added to embrasures on the forecastle deck during the same refit. Then she's transferred to the North America West Indies Station in August 1917 for convoy escort duties, and remained with them for the duration of war. Upon her return from that station, she was stationed in the Humber, and then, as said, was sold for scrap and broken up in 1920. Sad times. She was built, of course, by Pembroke Dockyard, which is one of those interesting things. When you start talking about Pembroke Dock and into Wales, people will often look at you and go, "Oh, do you mean Portsmouth?" Or, "Are you sure?" Yes. Pembroke Dockyard built lots of ships for the Royal Navy. Was really rather useful, including HMS Duke of Edinburgh. Doesn't pretty much exist now. But this is one of the things when you start to realise just how much infrastructure and capability the Royal Navy has at its disposal in the 1900s, before World War One. Even not discounting all the civilian-owned and operating infrastructure, they have a huge amount of naval infrastructure themselves they can deploy if they give them the money. Then we have HMS Black Prince. She's a gorgeous-looking ship. She's built by Thames Ironworks, who I'll be discussing a bit after this. She's laid down the 3rd of June 1903, launched the 8th of November 1904, and commissioned the 17th of March 1906. She, of course, will be famously sunk at the Battle of Jutlan. Now, at the beginning of the First World War, Black Prince was one of the cruisers, along with her sister, that was serving the 1st Cruiser Squadron and took part in the pursuit of Goeben and Breslau. She and Duke of Edinburgh were actually sent into the Red Sea to search for German merchant ships, as I discussed, while escorting convoys. And Black Prince, well, her and Duke of Edinburgh split up, so Duke of Edinburgh went and captured her merchant vessel, probably, but Black Prince went and captured the ocean liners Sudmark and Istria. So Black Prince won that sibling rivalry contest. On the 6th of November 1940, she was ordered to Gibraltar to join a squadron of French and British ships to search for German warships still at sea off the African coast. That was cancelled in November after the location of the German East Asia Squadron was revealed by survivors of the Battle of Cornell. Black Prince then joined the Grand Fleet in December 1914, along with her sister, and was put into the 1st Cruiser Squadron. Again, the modifications for the 6-inch guns were carried out to her, as well as to her sister. The origins of these 6-inch gun modifications and the decision put forward for them is often put as the Battle of Cornell. I don't agree. In the nicest way, these ships had been being lived with in their one issue was that deck of guns. They couldn't be operated in anything but calm seas. They are pretty much pointless, and they are pretty annoying. They were a risk constantly. The Battle of Cornell gives you a lovely justification to tell to the bean pushers and the politicians, oh, we've realised now we need to do this, but I think the Royal Navy had worked it out a while ago. And the speed of the modifications, the way the designs were already there and ready to go, seems to suggest to me that the plans had been in place for a while. This was a known problem with these ships, even before World War I began, and the moment they had the chance, they changed it. It was a design flaw inherited from William White, which Philip Watts hadn't realised how quickly it needed to be corrected and quite how problematic it was. But he did correct in subsequent designs. And this is where, again, I think it would be interesting, because I have a feeling if they had gone with the double turret version, the double gun version of the double 9.2 gun version, which there are conflicting reports as to whether it was considered or not. So let's say it's a what if. Then I have a feeling, the ship would have been slightly bigger, again. Not much bigger, though. And that would have affected seakeeping, but would have also affected probably the height of that deck in particular. Because I have a feeling it would have caused it to be raised up slightly, as well as the ship slightly broader beamed, which would have probably made it slightly more usable, but B, ultimately would have made the conversion a lot easier to the 6-inch guns up the top. She was, of course, built by the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company, which is one of those companies you just go, what the frick happened, Britain? Founded in 1837, it went defunct in 1912. Okay, there is a freaking naval race going on. The Royal Navy is building ships left, right, and centre. And a shipyard which has built such luminary ships as Argo, the first steamship to circumnavigate the world. HMS Warrior, the SMS König Wilhelm of the Prussian Navy, the Sans Parallel, the Fuji, and the Black Prince, as well as Thunderer. They literally, one of the last ships they build is a brand new dreadnought of the Orion class. So they built a brand new super dreadnought, 13.5-inch guns, all the rest of it, and they go bankrupt. They go defunct because they haven't got enough Navy orders. This is the reality. They hadn't got enough orders. And, you know, their actual owner at one point petitions Winston Churchill, then the First Lord Admiralty, regarding the lack of new orders. They have just built the super dreadnought for them. They're that good a yard, and the Admiralty can't give them any cruisers, anything. Right next to London as well, in a key voting district. Anyway, first Cruiser Squadron. It's worthwhile getting into this history of this particular organization because it's kind of a cool force. It is to me anyway. And there is a lovely painting of them you can find, and actually it's for sale, so that's why I have it sort of dell out in the background, which is of the first Cruiser Squadron in 1908 when they were commanded by Rear Admiral Sir Percy Scott. Flagship then was HMS Good Hope. Then there was also Black Prince, Duke of Edinburgh, Argyll, Hampshire, and Roxburgh there. Interesting enough, of those ships, only 2 survived World War One: Roxburgh and Duke of Edinburgh. So perhaps this squadron was not particularly lucky. We'll see. At different points, they consist of different ships. In August 1914, their composition includes HMS Defence, which was the flagship of Rear Admiral Ernest C. Troubridge, and Black Prince, and Duke of Edinburgh, and HMS Warrior. And they also had light cruisers, Chatham, Dublin, Gloucester, and Weymouth. So that's quite a capable little force if you think about it. That's 4 armoured cruisers, 4 light cruisers. That's not something which most fleets would like to come across coming at them. By January 1915, it had dropped down temporarily to Duke of Edinburgh, Black Prince, and Warrior. And in February, it returned to Defence, Duke of Edinburgh, Black Prince, and Warrior. It would stay in pretty much that form all the way through to Battle of Jutland. But interesting enough, after Jutland, it's disbanded. And then in October 1917, it's rebuilt. And it gets the large light cruisers, Courageous, Glorious, and Furious to be its members. You also pretty much have some very interesting admirals put in charge of it. Now, I'm going to talk about, I said, one of them now, one of the 3 commanders in this in World War One now, but I've done actual pages on 2 of them. So, for Troubridge and Arbuthnot, I've got actual pages of discussion, and I want to discuss them that way. But I'm going to quickly talk about Gordon Moore, that is, Sir Archibald Gordon Henry Wilson Moore, who had been 3rd Sea Lord 1912 to 1914 and was the commander of 1st Cruiser Squadron November 1914 to January 1915. He's an interesting officer. He had served as Naval Assistant to 1st Sea Lord in 1907, Director of Naval Ordnance and Torpedoes in 1909, He'd served in the First World War commanding the 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron. Pretty much after the moment he leaves 1st Cruiser Squadron, he goes to take command of 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron. He was, of course, Vice Admiral David Beatty's second in command at the Battle of Dogger Bank, and led the sinking of the Blucher. This meant he learned a lot of criticism for allowing the Seydlitz and the Flinger to escape. And so he's quietly removed from them and from the ground fleet and assigned to the 9th Cruiser Squadron in the Canary Islands, where the possibility of any appearance by German subships was remote. Now, I find this result problematic. And again, it's another example of an officer taking the fall for Beatty. Because Beatty's signals were the problems at Dogger Bank. Beatty was giving the orders. Moore should have probably taken charge and should have probably ignored Beatty and presumed he didn't know what he was doing. But that wasn't the way the Battlecruiser Force was set up. That wasn't the way the Royal Navy of World War I was running. Moore was not a Vian, or a Nelson, or a Somerville, or a Cunningham, or a Twitt, or any of the other officers who would have ignored what his senior officer was saying. That doesn't make him a bad officer. Obviously, you have to draw a line somewhere as to where you follow your orders of your senior officer and where you decide that actually they don't have the information. Now, let's say the average line is here. Good officers can be on a spectrum from up here to up here, or up here to down here. They're still good officers. But Philip Vians are down here. Moore's up here. That doesn't make him a bad officer. That means he just believes in his chain of command and believes his commanding officer must know what he's doing. But honestly, 1st Cruiser Squadron seems to be unlucky for ships and unlucky for their admirals. And especially unlucky for this. This is the Minotaur class, and as I said, they are not my favourite design of Royal Navy armoured cruisers. Again, they produced this design, they go, oh, we've got a double turret! Okay, fine. And so we're going to festoon it with 7.5-inch guns in a multi-turret ship which looks messy. Honestly, I think the ships would have been better if they'd had gone for the sort of double 9.2s, and had gone for a uniform dreadnought-style armament, but with the 9.2s. And considering when they're built, between 1905 and 1909, that certainly should have been on the radar. But they didn't. In fact, in many ways, it's their preceding Warrior class which are more like that, and I would argue the Warrior class are better for that. The Warrior class are probably the best designed of all the armoured cruisers, but again, honestly, they need that double 9.2 turret. The Minotaurs get the double 9.2, but then they get all these extra 7.5s, which are... what are they there for? We're in the age of directed gunnery. You've built HMS Dreadnought. Why are you festooning your ship like we're still a pre-Dreadnought era? HMS Defence, of course, will be sunk at the Battle of Jutland. And it's often used as the flagship. Again, some cruisers are built for flagship roles, some aren't. Now, here is a very nice gentleman. He is called Admiral Troubridge, and he gets into trouble, Ernest Troubridge does, because of the pursuit of Goeben and Breslau. He had risen through the ranks quickly. He was considered a very bright, very capable officer. He had actually been private naval secretary to Reginald McKenna. And before, Reginald McKenna was succeeded by Churchill and was promoted in 1911 to Rear Admiral. In 1912, he became Chief of the War Staff. And this was the time when he drew up the naval strategy in the event of war breaking out. The plans, such as they were, involved establishment of a massive cordon of warships in British warships, were criticised by a large number of naval officers, and were eventually considered unsound in some naval exercise manoeuvres in the summer of 1912. Troubridge was replaced by Sir Henry Jackson in post and returned to active sea service. However, the ideas were not as unsound as you necessarily think they should be. It doesn't suggest. The reason they were unsound and the reason they were developed in the first place was based on the infrastructure and logistical limitations the Royal Navy was at that time currently operating with. In fact, whilst Troubridge was in charge of the war staff, he outlined himself as saying the more effectually we are able to stifle German trade, the greater would be the risks which Germany would be willing to run with her naval and military forces to secure the continuance of some trade. And running these risks might provide us with a more favourable means for defeating her forces. In fact, he goes further. Any increase in the suffering inflicted by the naval means would produce a morale effect and tend to excite public opinion in Germany to insist on the fleet coming out to meet ours, which was what we desired. The entire basis of the strategy he is articulating, and perhaps not as well as he could, and I think honestly this is more behind his replacement, isn't the quality of the strategy he's putting forward, but it's his articulation and explanation of the strategy, which certainly does not come into the nuance that Corbett can espouse and others at the time, is that the thrust of it is to get the German fleet to come out to fight the Royal Navy. The strategy is an offensive-defensive strategy, in that the quicker we can neutralize the German Navy, the quicker you neutralize the threat to the British Isles, the quicker you neutralize the threat to resupplying forces ashore, the quicker you neutralize the threat to Britain's economic powerhouse and Britain's economic capabilities. So everything is focused around that, which is a very sensible planning assumption in some regards. It means he gets into trouble, though, when it comes to some of the more defensively minded people. Gets into trouble when it comes to some of the people who are more Elan-focused. And it gets into trouble with some of the people who, how do I put this, are uncomfortable with the British way of war, the economic warfare capability. Doesn't make it bad strategy, though. Just makes it badly articulated. It hasn't been put forward in a way in which those groups can't disagree with you. That is Troubridge's problem, but it does ultimately lead him to getting what he would much prefer, which is a seagoing post, and Troubridge is nothing if not a seagoing officer. But the point I'm trying to make about him is he's an experienced and capable admiral, an experienced and capable naval officer, who had tried to come up with a plan that didn't prove ultimately that good. Is he a great officer? Probably not. But is he a decent officer? Yes. And I feel this is further vindicated by what happens next. The pursuit of the Goeben and Breslau, that's an interesting story. That is always comes up, and it's one of the things that they get out and they get away. But you have to realize what's going on behind the story. There are lots of communications going backwards and forwards. On the entry of sort of the British First World War in early August 1914, Germany had these two ships. Let's battle cruiser, older one, Goeben, and a light cruiser, quite a new one, Breslau.
With 2 ships in the Mediterranean, the Germans were actually a very small factor in the overall force structure of the potential Axis force in the Mediterranean. You always have to remember that it's potential Axis forces. So the Royal Navy was manoeuvring and the French Navy were manoeuvring to try and cover with various squadrons the both potential movement of the Germans, to cover the movement of the French troops from North Africa, which were critical to the French army's operations in Northern Europe, and more importantly, what the Italians could potentially do, because remember, they are technically part of the Triple Alliance. They are the third member. The fact that they will end up switching sides is just pure Italianism. And what the Austro-Hungarians are going to do. Now, you can sit there and look at their history and go, why did the Germans think that any alliance, which included both the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians, going to work, considering how many times they'd already had tiffs and fights and full-blown wars? But they did. But this meant that the Royal Navy was constantly having to cover those. And all the messages going through complicated this. Troubridge's force is deployed of 4 of his heavy cruisers and 4 light cruisers. That's 4 ships with some 9.2 inch guns, but mostly 7.5s, and 4 ships which are mostly town class. Now, on paper, that's a pretty strong force. That's a pretty independent force, but they're still responding to the local Mediterranean Fleet command structure in terms of their deployments, in terms of what they're doing, because that's a major force concentration for the Mediterranean. And that's part of covering all the operations going on. And into this comes...
But they have a tremendous amount of communications going backwards and forwards from London and causing them issues, and instructions going backwards and forwards. This includes orders transmitted directly from good old Winston Churchill. And these orders had been that the British force in the Mediterranean was not to engage superior forces. However, Churchill just wrote that. He didn't write that he intended this to only cover should the Austro-Hungarian and Italian fleet come out. No, he just wrote that the British Mediterranean fleet should not, and forces in the Mediterranean should not engage superior forces. So Troubridge took this to include Germans as well, because that's how it's worded. This came from the First Lord of the Admiralty, so his civilian master, he has to take instructions. The orders, furthermore, transmitted to Milne, his commander, this gentleman, stated that the primary objective of Milne and of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean was to support the transport of French troops, with the engagement of individual German ships a secondary objective, and that a superior force should only be engaged in combination with the French. Ouch. Troubridge had served in the Russo-Japanese War. He had experience there and was aware that modern naval ordnance could devastate his squadron. He was also aware that Goeben's 11-inch guns could outrange his own, which consisted of 9.2-inch guns and 7.5-inch guns, and he didn't have enough of the 9.2-inch guns, in his view, to actually counterbalance the 11-inch guns. This is where those lots more 9.2-inch guns would have been useful. He tried a night attack on the German force using the cruiser HMS Dublin, but it failed to make contact, so she couldn't do her torpedo attack. Therefore, Troubridge attempted to catch the Germans in the narrow waters to reduce range, i.e., force them into a narrow area where they couldn't just sit at range and blast him away merrily, but would have to actually get into close water. It's pretty darn offensive thinking. He was unaware, of course, of their intentions. He thought they might try and double back to the northeast and effect a junction with the Austro-Hungarian fleet. That, to him, made far more sense than running for the Ottomans, who couldn't support them. Whereas going and joining the Austro-Hungarians, that becomes a mighty force then. So Troubridge resolved to intercept the German squadron and headed southwards with the intention to do so. His flag captain, though, is a guy that comes into the picture. He's a guy called Fawcett Ray, and is a noted gunnery expert. Probably one of the best gunnery officers in the Royal Navy at the time, in the view of many. Ray argued that it would be suicide for the squadron to fight the bigger and longer range guns of the Goeben, and as Ray had a particular reputation, Troubridge is persuaded by it. Troubridge is actually in tears when he orders the fleet chase to be abandoned. That's according to at least one story. And Ray responds to this: "Sir, this is the bravest thing you've ever done." His signal to Milne is: "Being only able to meet Goeben outside the range of our guns and inside his, I have abandoned the chase with my squadron. Goeben evidently going to the eastern Mediterranean." Troubridge and Milne are both court-martialed for this, and for them to get away. Troubridge is ordered back to Britain in September. Has to go through a full court of inquiry held at the Navigation School in Portsmouth. After the investigation of the events surrounding the chase, the inquiry decided to court-martial Troubridge on his grounds of his failure to engage the enemy. Court-martial is held aboard HMS Bulwark at Portland between the 5th and 9th of November 1914. So they have a court of inquiry, and then they have a full court-martial. The court-martial's verdict is the charge is not proved, owing to the nature of his orders, the Admiralty's failure to clarify them, and that Troubridge was fully honourably acquitted. However, here is what I find annoying. Fawcett Ray, who is this guy who argued this, goes on to other commands. He becomes a rear admiral. He gets to go and command other ships, and he's useful. He's on various operations, and perhaps honestly he's saved because he's transferred from HMS Defence to HMS Talbot. But he's saved in large part because of his connections with Lord Charles Beresford, who still has some power in the Admiralty at this time, and Ray is one of his beloved officers. So Ray was the one who argued and persuaded his admiral, not to do it. He was the flag captain. But he doesn't get censured. And yes, the buck does stop with Troubridge and with Milne. But their orders, they never get another seagoing command. Yes, he reaches admiral. But in the nicest way, you can argue he made the sensible choice. I myself think he could have won the battle. I think if he considering the speed Goeben could probably actually achieve at that point, and the speed that his ships could, Goeben wouldn't have had the commanding advantage in pace. Goeben's top design speed, remember, is 25.5 knots. But by the time she's on this operation, she has been at service for a long time. She's not had a full maintenance, all those sort of things she needs. I think the 23 knots, I think, is probably where she probably comes in at, probably 23 knots. And I think the cruisers could have engaged her. Do I think they'd have lost ships? Yes. But again, we have the advantage of hindsight. We know exactly how thick Goeben's armour is. We know that it's between 3 and 11 inches thick. We know what their capabilities are, what their gun turret thickness are, what their deck armour is. We also know a lot more about the quality of her crew than they did. So we can make this assessment in hindsight. But if you have the information Troubridge did, and you have you have your own experience from the Russo-Japanese War, where you have seen what the power of long-range guns have done to a fleet which couldn't respond. No doubt, because he was out there during the Russo-Japanese War. And you have a noted gunnery expert, someone who has spoken on in the same breath as Jellicoe, as Percy Scott, standing next to you, telling you this. He's a good admiral. He is certainly better than what comes next. Rear Admiral Sir Robert Arbuthnot, the gentleman who managed to get 1st Cruiser Squadron pretty much annihilated in the Battle of Jutlan. And arguably, the reason he gets the squadron annihilated is because he and a lot of other admirals have got what's happened to Troubridge going around in his head. Because for how many admirals would look at Troubridge's decision-making going, actually, I can understand it, but, oh, good lord, he's never going to know Sea Command command. His career's ruined. And it's over. Troubridge's career is over. But Arbuthnot does have his protectors. Even though he has issues, and when I say this man has issues, that's me being polite. Admiral in 1912, he'd been a Commodore 2nd class since 1910. He'd been a captain from 1902. He was a motorcyclist, all sorts of interesting things. But I'm going to use this quote from Chatfield when talking about him before we start getting into most of the stuff. Many have wondered why the gallant Arbuthnot so moved his squadron of armoured cruisers. The truth, I think, is this. He was an old friend of mine. We had not lost touch since my midshipman's days in the Warspite, and had played together in the United Service rugby team for 2 years. He'd been commander in the Royal Sovereign in the Mediterranean when I was in the Caesar, and captain of the Lord Nelson when I was in the Venerable. In the spring of 1916, I had lunch with him on board the Defence at Scapa, and I confided in him, as I had often done, my thoughts on gunnery matters. After lunch, we'd gone for a walk on the mainland, and it was during this walk he told me how he intended to manoeuvre his squadron in action. He was stationed on one of the wings of the battle fleet during the approach, as is called, before deployment in the line of battle. But after his deployment, his squadron was stationed in the rear of the battle line. Should, therefore, the battle fleet deploy towards the wing on which he was stationed, it would be necessary for him to move his squadron onto the opposite flank, a distance of about 5 miles. He could, he said, either do this by passing down the disengaged side of the battle fleet, which would, he felt, be a dull performance, or he could pass down on the engaged side between the two opposing fleets. I said I thought he should go down the disengaged side, between the two opposing disengaged side. If he went between the fleets, he might find himself in a highly dangerous position. But what was even more, his smoke might well interfere with the fire of our battle fleet at a critical time. He was inclined to pooh-pooh both these objections, and I realised he was determined to go down between the two fleets, which he said he could only take a few minutes. He was a gallant soul. At sea and in sport, nothing daunted him. He was one of those very special types that the Navy produces. He was accomplished at all games. He captained the Navy at rugby and cricket, and was a great runner, and unbeatable in his prime over an obstacle course. An advocate of physical training, which he was largely responsible for introducing into the Navy, a strict disciplinarian and as difficult to serve, yet a staunch friend and without serious fault outside his duty. When I saw 1st Cruiser Squadron steam across my bows, I recalled this conversation. His fate I had not foreseen. Disciplinarian is a nice phrase for someone who is an absolute in command. Certainly wouldn't listen to his flag captain. In fact, there are details of him with previous flag captains of him bullying so much that he basically captained his own ship and micromanaged everything. Jellicoe has various notes about his micromanaging. Arbuthnot is a very skilled and very bright officer, but he is a micromanager. And he's also does exactly that. He causes great trouble for the Grand Fleet by putting his smoke in front of them. He charges down and gets his ship sunk. Not just his ship. He breaks up his entire squadron. Black Prince is lost to his squadron. Duke of Edinburgh can't follow him. And the two ships which do follow him into this attack, into his manoeuvre, they both get sunk. His own ship, Defence, gets sunk. His own ship gets sunk. And the other ship in the group, Warrior, gets sunk. Because of his manoeuvre. Going between two battle fleets. In armoured cruisers. And then people have sometimes the temerity to tell me the armoured cruiser is a terrible design and they shouldn't have been in service. Well, they should have been in service. They're perfectly good at what they're supposed to do. At no point did anyone say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to design a ship which goes between two battle fleets. Or rather they do. They're called battleships. The armoured cruiser is not supposed to charge between the two battle lines. That's not its purpose. Destroyers, they charge between the battle lines, but that was part of their purpose. With their torpedoes dashing backwards and forwards. But they were light enough to dot us and small enough to be hard to hit with main guns, so they'd be having to use lighter weapons. And the whole point was they were supposed to launch their torpedoes, and to extent destroyers and torpedo boats were expendable. You didn't want to lose ships, you didn't want to lose lives, but they were a lot cheaper and easier to replace than a cruiser. So now we get the Battle of Jutlan and the loss of the Black Prince, and this is what I want to sort of discuss. So, at around 1742 hours, the Black Prince lost contact with the rest of the squadron as it came into contact with the German forces. And a wireless signal is heard from her at 20:45 hours, reporting a submarine sighting. We know she's still afloat then, and we know what happens to her because of the German sources. Black Prince briefly engaged the dreadnought Rhineland at 23:35 hours, scoring 2 hits with her 6-inch guns. Later she sighted more German ships and attempted to turn away, but unfortunately, Fergan illuminated Black Prince. As you can see in this picture, you've got roughly 3 battleships around her, all illuminating her. There's possibly as many 5. They included Nassau of Friesland and Friedrich the Gross. She's a lone cruiser. She is engaged by 5 dreadnoughts at point-blank range. 750 to 1,500 yards. Matapan, eat your heart out. Again, this is night fighting, and the issues of night fighting. And again, it's the thing, it can play cruel tricks on both sides. But that's a loss of Prince. Black Prince was lost because of what she ended up in. She ended up totally surrounded, totally outnumbered. And this comes again down to Arbuthnot. I'm sorry, but the whole decision comes down to that commander. It comes down to him deciding that it was more important to try and be dashing and brave. And yes, whilst he was inclined that way, I think he was pushed that way by the treatment of Troubridge. And if you consider Troubridge, would he have done it? Would he have charged down the engaged side of the Grand Fleet? No! Because he's not an idiot! Because no amount of pursuit of glory or honour is worth killing his own men. He would have engaged the German battle cruisers if the orders he felt had covered it. They were ambiguity, thanks to Winston Churchill and thanks to others getting involved, that they didn't know what they were doing. And this is the trouble when you're trying to have a centralized command structure, trying to tell everyone what to do from thousands of miles away when they don't have the information of what's going on. But Arbuthnot doesn't have any of those excuses. Arbuthnot is doing it. The Black Prince and the Duke of Edinburgh. Good-looking ships. So what's the summary? Well, this is going to be a long video, so what is the summary? The summary is that they never had much of a chance. They were excellent ships for peacetime roles, and they were excellent ships for the roles they were envisaged for wartime. But the reason Black Prince is lost is because of the scenario she's faced in. First of all, her squadron disintegrates, and she's lost slightly before the squadron really starts to disintegrate, but I do sometimes wonder whether she has engine troubles or whether her captain just looks at his admiral and thinks, I'm going to be part of this battle, but I'm going to find my own way. Duke of Edinburgh does something similar and ends up being very useful in basically being turned into Jellicoe's personal cruiser for a couple of moments in the battle at key points and providing him with key duties. So you do wonder whether that was Black Prince's captain's idea of how to be useful in the battle, not to follow Arbuthnot. The point about these ships, though, is they offer a lot of potential for what could have been. They were big enough and powerful enough that Goeben was running from them. You've seen that picture earlier. This picture is apparently of Goeben looking aft and looking for British cruisers in the distance. Probably, I think, one of those is Breslau, trying to drive off the British light cruiser that's following closely. But the point is, the British cruisers were never far behind, and Goeben didn't want to fight them. And if Troubridge had the orders and had brought around a battle, yes, he'd have lost ships. Do I think he'd have lost Duke of Edinburgh and Black Prince? No. Do I think defence would have probably been sunk? I hope not, because that would have lost Troubridge. And I think he was a good admiral. But ultimately, as good as they are, there are flaws in this design. There is the 6-inch casement, which just doesn't work. There is the fact that if you are leading towards building an all-big gun ship, you would expect the next generation after this to be an all-big gun cruiser. And to an extent, the Warriors are. But then come the defense, the Minotaur class, which aren't. And I think really the problem for cruisers, ultimately for the Royal Navy, is the battle cruiser. Because when it comes in at first, it's a little bit bigger, but it's a lot more capable, and so we'll build that. But the battle cruiser quickly expands in size. And you still have the cruisers in service, so that you don't need to worry about it. But the legacy of these ships is that they were fine, and they were good, and capable, and helpful. But their losses meant that when it comes to the end of World War I, no one's really making the case for them, because they look at them and they go, but you can be easily destroyed by a battlecruiser. Yes, but how much damage will I inflict on our battlecruiser while protecting your precious convoys? But we will never fight another war like this again, so we'll never have to fight another convoy war. How short-sighted of you. But we are right, this was the war to end all wars. They've said that after so many wars. I'm sorry for the little pantomime, but it makes the point. They are potential, and they are wasted potential. But but they're still good ships. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the Duke of Edinburgh class, and I hope you enjoy all the other ships which are coming up in the year of the Cruiser. We have the Forward class next week, and the Norfolk class the week after that. Enjoy, take care, and thank you for watching.